next episode of Trust Talk, we meet Steve Heywood. He is the general manager of Edelman in the Netherlands, known for the annual Edelman Trust Barometer. The 2020 research signals an alarming trust gap between the informed public and the general public, also known as the trust paradox. A majority of the general public does not believe that they will have a better life than their parents, a decline in how they look at the world, but also at trust in the four institutions that Edelman researches: government, media, business, and NGOs. Steve touches upon the sort of information which people base their trust. Research finds a declining number of people reading newspapers, but rather getting their information from social media, TV, and online forums. It is important to rebuild trust in social media, not by using more AI. Research shows that the majority of people are worried about the weaponization of fake news on COVID-19 and the election process in the US. What is traditional media doing wrong to fail to meet the audience's needs and to therefore seek other sources of information? He talks about action communication and the need for governments to pull on those affected by unemployment, involving them in solutions, and for companies to work on re-skills for their workforce. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Steve, welcome at Trust Talk. You are the general manager of the Amsterdam office of Edelman. For those that don't know Edelman, maybe good to introduce both yourself and the company.
Yeah, thanks very much for the chance to be here on the podcast today. I'm Steve Heywood, the general manager of Edelman. Edelman is a communications consultancy helping brands to evolve, protect, and promote their reputation. And Edelman is also the home of the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a piece of research that for the last 20 years has looked into trust. So it's great to be here today talking about trust.
How many people working in the Amsterdam office of Edelman?
Yeah, so in Amsterdam, we've got around 85 people working in our office. It's a combination of communications consultants, creatives, strategy and planning people, and also these days quite a few data scientists as well.
And their research, how are they conducting the research? Is that by surveys or?
Yeah, so for the Edelman Trust Barometer, the research is done by survey, mainly online, and we control for that in countries where internet penetration is not so high. More generally at Edelman, we use a range of research techniques, roughly split into three areas. There's kind of human behavior, there's predictive intelligence, and then there's perhaps more the classic research as well. And actually, just a few months ago, we relaunched our research arm as Edelman Data and Intelligence, DXI. And the reason we did that is because we recognize it's becoming quite a global affair. So rather than having pockets of expertise in different offices, we now have kind of one global team working across all of the questions our clients have around data. And it's fascinating the way that's going. If I think back a few years, when I would look at doing some thought leadership for a senior executive in a company, to be honest, just sort of make educated guesses about what topics they should stand for. You know, you'd look at their business priorities, you'd kind of look at what was the thing of the day, and you'd create a platform on the basis of that. And these days we can actually use sort of hard data, use real data to understand what is their tone of voice at the moment, what tone of voice their competitors have, what topics do their audience engage with, what topics might be adjacent to that, and where might there be white space that they could own a topic. And I think I could never have dreamt to be working in an industry where this much data would inform the decisions you make. And it's really interesting the direction that the business is going in.
The last 2020 Trust Barometer describes an alarming trust inequality, mentioning two different trust realities. I think you call it the trust paradox.
You're right. The 2020 findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer do show alarming divergence in trust between two different groups of people, and we call that a trust paradox because it almost seems to be that these two groups of people are inhabiting parallel universes when it comes to trust. On the one hand, you have what we call the informed public. This audience have much higher levels of trust in government, in the media, and other institutions. On the other hand, you have the general public. This group of people have much lower levels of trust. They are much more questioning whether business is there to support them, whether government is helping them to have a better life. And in fact, one particular question that's very interesting is a finding that most respondents in the general public category believe that they will not have a better life than their parents. So there's a real decline in the way they see the world and they see their experience of the world. Perhaps it's important to take a step back and explain what we mean by informed public and general public audiences.
Right, that was my question.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to informed public, we're talking about people who consume the news quite regularly, have a college education, and have an income in the top 25% of society. So certainly not the 1%, but the sort of segment of society which is more engaged in current affairs, which has a higher level of education and which has a correspondingly higher income in general. That's the informed public audience. And the general public audience is all of the other respondents that have been surveyed, minus that segment. So it's the more general section of the population with the informed public audience removed.
Of course, these days it becomes really challenging if you talk about the informed public, because what are their sources of information?
That's a fantastic question. And what we do know from our research is that all audiences, both informed public and general, they actually are a little bit more sophisticated in the way they consume media than we perhaps give them credit for. So we see that whilst people in general don't read newspapers anymore, and maybe that's a bit of a bold statement, but if we look at the sales figures in most countries of the newspapers, we can back it up. They do still consume news, and they're consuming news on social media, in online forums, and also from news media and news websites, as well as from the TV, of course. So they are consuming news, but less frequently and from a much broader range of sources than previously.
Well, especially the last point, I think, is what we should be worried about. Samuel Woolley just published a book. It's called The Reality Game. And it has a very discomforting subtitle, How the Next Wave of Technology Will Break the Truth. And he argues that we are fighting fake news caused by artificial intelligent bots by using even more AI. And he argues that is a mistake. What's your view on that?
I think that's a very interesting point of view. To me, what's critical is that trust is rebuilt in social media and in the way people consume media. So whether the mechanism to do that is AI layered on AI or whether it's more human response, I'm not sure. I don't think I'm the expert in that. But what I do know is it's really important to be able to rebuild trust in social media. And we see that the vast majority of correspondents, I believe it's over 80%, who we ask are actually quite worried about fake news and also the weaponization of fake news. So when we sort of double click on issues such as COVID-19 or geopolitics, you see that people are really worried about the way that fake news can be used as a weapon. And I think that shows that there is a burning platform here and that action needs to be taken. As I say, I'm not sure I know exactly how that should be executed from the social media networks, but I do know it has to happen.
The other day I watched a television series about the Pizzagate. I'm sure you are familiar with Pizzagate in the US, right? In my view, that's an example of how uninformed people who do think they read news go out of their minds in accusing a single restaurant of being host to child pornography and all that stuff more. And so it's an example of how you see that if you are not well informed, if your sources are the ones that look like well-informed people, but in fact are not, they can set up people against each other and come to this ridiculous circumstances that caused Pizzagate, the restaurant where this all happened, to become such a drama.
I think the question we have to ask ourselves is perhaps not what are these irreputable sources doing wrong or how to ban them. I think that's certainly one approach. But to me, the more interesting question is what is traditional media doing wrong to fail to meet that audience's needs and to therefore seek them to look for these other sources of information. And I think that perhaps is at the crux of some of these issues regarding media and media consumption. Why is it that people have turned away from mainstream media? Why is it that those sources are not compelling to them and are not the places they're most frequently visiting to see news and to consume news media? So I think that's a very interesting area to explore, to try to understand how we can protect against those sort of tragic events where, rumors and fake news swirl into real life consequences and with potentially devastating results. I think it's very interesting to think about the role media could play in a more positive sense to address that.
Do you see a role of Edelman in this?
Yeah, well, our purpose is to build trust between brands and society. So I absolutely do see a role for Edelman within that. And I think one of the things that we always talk to our clients about is the need to take action. So it's not enough just to communicate. You actually need to do what we call action communications. You need to communicate and you need to take real action. And a great example of that is a lot of the advice we've given, perhaps at times not always what people wanted to hear, but this year when brands are asking what to do in response to the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matters movement. And it's not something that can be done through a communications point of view only. You need to take action on systemic racism within your business, and you need to make real steps to change the composition of your business and the way you serve your customers and the way you participate in society.
According to this year's Trust Barometer, 83% of employees say they fear losing their job because of the gig economy, fear of recession, a lack of skills, cheaper foreign competitors, immigrants who will work for less, automation or jobs being moved to other countries. So employees do not seem to have much trust in their future. How do you explain the sudden pessimism, also in the light of recent growth projections from the IMF?
So one of the things that's quite interesting is that even before the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that had on the economy, people were actually very pessimistic about their future economic prospects. This is particularly the general population we're talking about here. Even in what was at that time sort of the crest of a wave of almost unparalleled global growth, and particularly that it was quite uniform growth around the world. So what I think that shows is, again, perhaps we underestimate how smart the man and woman on the street is. Because they look at their supermarket and they see the automated tills, or they look at their job driving a car and then they now see a gig economy job that's replaced it on a platform, and they see that the way that these industries are going is to reduce labour costs and perhaps reduce their chance to participate in the labour market. And I think, again, what works best for society is when brands, also government, are honest about these topics and they participate and pull in the people affected into being part of the solution. For example, you see that some companies are working on programs to reskill their workforce for the jobs of the future. And I think those sort of initiatives are particularly important when it comes to building trust in the long-term economy. So outside of the cycle of boom and bust, and particularly in such a volatile period at the moment, but to build trust in the overall direction. And that's something that I believe is quite critical to having a stable society in which everyone can benefit.
Yeah, well, the fear of job loss is nothing new. That we have seen that over centuries, right? I mean, the guy who is lighting the lanterns in the road by hand is no longer there.
It's a very fair point. It's a very fair point. And indeed, some of these themes are somewhat kind of evergreen. And as I mentioned, we've been looking at the Trust Barometer for 20 years. So indeed, you do see some recurring themes even in that time. Also, of course, as you mentioned, you can go back even further. And that's true. I mean, perhaps you can say the rate of change is certainly very fast at the moment. I'm not particularly someone that likes to say everything is increasing and it's unprecedented, et cetera, et cetera. I find that a bit bombastic, but there is something in the fact that the rate of change is very fast at the moment, and people have a lot of questions about how they can, keep their relevance in society, I think, and that is at the heart of this somehow.
So the two attributes of trust, competence and ethics are often mentioned in your reports. Competence as in delivering on promises and ethical behavior, doing the right thing and working to improve society. The 2020 Trust Barometer outcome is rather negative here as well. None of the 4 institutions that you mentioned earlier are seen as both competent and ethical. That doesn't sound very well, does it? What's causing that?
No, I fully agree that at first look, these are quite depressing findings, and it's clear that all 4 institutions need to do more to build trust with society. On the other hand, to me, the 2020 Trust Barometer also had a message of hope or a direction kind of buried within those findings. So what they show is that whilst at the moment, all of those 4 institutions are not performing particularly well in terms of having high levels of trust, what you do see is a hypothesis that perhaps if those institutions cooperate together, they can build on the characteristics of each other. So some of those institutions are seen as competent, some are seen as ethical, none are seen as both. So for example, business is seen as relatively competent, NGOs are seen as ethical but not competent, and government at that time was seen as not particularly either. But you do see that perhaps building together programs, so partnerships between business and NGOs, government and the media, these institutions coming together, they can perhaps create a halo effect and create an impact that's greater than they could alone and build higher levels of trust by sort of trading off each other's strengths and weaknesses to create something greater than the sum of the whole.
Talking about trust in institutions and the role governments have.
Yep.
I just watched a movie on New York Times, a video actually, of a top-ranking official in US state Georgia, almost passionately asking the president to condemn the threats of violence against election officials. All the results of disinformation about fraudulent elections, how do you look at these developments?
I think that it's really important to take a step back and to think about the role of each institution. So in a difficult situation, such as this period of uncertainty with the US election results, what is the purpose of each institution? And when we look back over this time, what will the institution want to be recognized for what it's done? So in the case of business, for instance, I think business's role, and our research in fact shows this, is not to be broadcasting its opinions on what it wants to see. It's to be reassuring its workforce, and it's to be taking perhaps a back seat in that particular moment. The other side of that is it's absolutely the moment for the government to act. It's the time for government to protect and build trust in the election process and to build trust in the route forward. And I think that's something which each country has a different system, each country has different responsibilities for the different branches of government. But if we look at government overall, which is the level at which we do this global research, US being a large part of it, but actually only one of 28 countries, we see high expectations for government to do the right thing. So I would say, as a kind of interested foreigner and also working for an American company, that the most important thing is that government is seen to do the right thing and does the right thing. And to me, that would be taking a more active role in ensuring a fair and transparent process. But again, that's a personal opinion.
To conclude our interview, what would be the largest challenges of Edelman for their next generation barometers?
So it's a really fascinating question. This has been quite a special year. So the Edelman Trust Barometers, I've mentioned a few times, have been going for 20 years. Normally we do one main report per year, perhaps a couple of special reports, something that dives into a particular sector or a particular issue we think is interesting. In the last 12 months, we've done 10 reports at the Edelman Trust Barometer, which reflects...
In 1 year?
In 1 year.
Oh, wow.
Which reflects the incredibly volatile year that we've had. So we've had to produce special reports that look at the early stages of COVID-19, what that might mean for brands and society. Then there was the realization of the sort of deep-seated racial injustice and the kind of injustice emergency that led to brands recognizing they had to act, and a whole bunch of research around that. And then we've had election period in the US. And then on top of that, we've had, quite an interesting year in a couple of other different areas too. So I think the biggest challenge for the road ahead is going to be to work out how to create a trust barometer which can serve the next 20 years and provide that continued longitudinal survey and that sort of long-term findings, but also be responsive to these short-term issues and these moments. Because I think something we can all be sure about is there will be more volatility and more things that happen in the years ahead, which we'll also be interested to look at from a trust dimension. So I think that will be the key challenge, to keep the consistency, but also to respond and evolve to the world out there.
Steve, thank you very much for the interview.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Trust Talk. Don't miss out on future travels around trust, and subscribe to this channel or visit us on our website, trusttalk.co, or on Twitter @TrustTalkCO. We look forward to seeing you again soon.